before we journey into the blood-soaked annals of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, where terror became the architect of the ancient world's most feared dominion. If you find yourself drawn to history's darkest truths, please hit that like button and subscribe for more revelations from antiquity's shadows. Comment below to share where you're witnessing this tale unfold. It amazes me that from Cairo to California, from Delhi to Dublin, we're united in this moment, peering together into the abyss of human cruelty that birthed an empire. Today we follow Ashur-dan, a young scribe who witnessed firsthand how implements of torture forged the mightiest realm of the ancient world. The bronze gates of Nineveh groaned open as dawn painted the Tigris crimson. Ashur-dan, barely 16 summers old, clutched his clay tablets against his chest, his fingers trembling not from cold but from anticipation. Today marked his first assignment as junior scribe to the royal torturer. The courtyard ahead writhed with morning shadows, and the air carried a metallic tang that made his stomach turn. Guards in scale armor flanked the entrance to the Chamber of Truth, their faces hidden behind bronze helmets shaped like snarling lions. "You're the new recorder," growled the captain, his voice rough as grinding millstones. Ashur-dan nodded, unable to trust his voice. Beyond those doors lay the instruments that had built an empire spanning from the mountains of Urartu to the shores of the Mediterranean. The captain's laugh was bitter. "Boy, you'll either emerge from these chambers hardened like iron in the forge, or you'll break like pottery against stone. There is no middle path in service to Ashur." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward Ashur-dan like grasping fingers. He stepped forward, knowing that once he crossed this threshold, the innocent scribe who entered would never leave. The empire demanded transformation, and the tools of that change waited within. The chamber's walls pressed close, adorned with reliefs depicting the empire's victories, cities aflame, enemies prostrate, kings in chains. Master Nabusharu stood beside a table arrayed with implements that gleamed like deadly jewels in the torchlight. His hands, scarred from decades of work, moved with practiced precision as he selected each tool. "Your first lesson, young scribe," he intoned without looking up, "is that fear builds stronger foundations than stone." The prisoner, a captured Elamite noble, hung suspended by bronze chains, his silk robes torn and stained. Ashur-dan forced himself to observe, to record every detail as his training demanded. The master torturer circled his subject, like a sculptor examining marble. "This man knows the location of hidden grain stores. His people will starve this winter unless he speaks." Nabusharu lifted an instrument, a bronze rod ending in a small wheel of sharpened points. "The Assyrian flower," he named it, almost tenderly. "Applied correctly, it convinces without killing, persuades without destroying future usefulness." The Elamite's eyes widened, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chamber's chill. Ashur-dan's stylus trembled as he pressed cuneiform into soft clay, recording the empire's terrible efficiency. Each stroke felt like a betrayal of his childhood dreams of becoming a keeper of epic poems and royal genealogies. Yet here, in this dark heart of empire, he was learning the true poetry of power, written not in words, but in screams. 3 days passed before the Elamite noble finally broke. Ashur-dan had filled 7 tablets with meticulous records of each session, each application of imperial justice. His dreams now echoed with sounds he wished he could unhear. In the scribe's quarters that evening, he sat alone, staring at his hands, still clean, yet somehow stained. His childhood friend, Shamash-Ilu, found him there. "You look as though you've aged a decade in 3 days, his friend observed, settling beside him on the reed mat. Shamash-Ilu served in the cavalry, training horses for the endless campaigns. His world was one of open skies and thundering hooves, not windowless chambers and muffled screams. The Empire requires all kinds of servants, Ashur-dan replied, his voice hollow. Some wield swords, others styluses. His friend frowned. But surely there's honor in battle, while this... He gestured vaguely toward the palace's eastern wing, where the chambers lay. This is different. Ashur-dan laughed bitterly. Different? We both serve the same master, the same purpose. Your horses trample enemies in the field. The chambers extract secrets that prevent battles. Which saves more Assyrian lives? The question hung between them like a blade. Outside, the city of Nineveh hummed with evening activity. Merchants closing shops, families gathering for meals, children playing in dusty streets. All of it made possible by the terrible machinery of fear that ground on in the palace depths. The summons came at dawn. King Ashur-dan himself would observe today's interrogation. Ashur-dan had never stood so close to divinity made flesh. The king entered the chamber like a storm-given form, his beard oiled and curled, gold ornaments catching every flicker of torchlight. Behind him trailed generals and advisors, their faces masks of studied indifference. The prisoner this time was different, a former Assyrian governor accused of skimming tribute meant for Nineveh's treasuries. Treachery from within, the king's voice resonated like distant thunder. Wounds deeper than any foreign blade. Master Nabu-Sharu bowed low. Your Majesty honors us with his presence. The king's eyes, cold as winter stars, surveyed the assembled implements. Show me how Empire maintains its grip, Master Torturer. Show this traitor the price of betraying Assyrian trust. The accused governor, once proud in his authority, now trembled like a reed in storm winds. He had overseen similar scenes in his own provincial capital, never imagining he would one day occupy the victim's position. Ashur-dan positioned himself carefully, close enough to record every word, far enough to avoid the king's direct attention. He watched Ashur-dan face as Nabu-Sharu began his work, saw not cruelty, but calculation, not sadism, but statecraft. This was empire distilled to its essence. The absolute certainty that rebellion, betrayal, or resistance would meet consequences too terrible to contemplate. The very walls seemed to lean in, bearing witness to power teaching its ultimate lesson. The governor's confession revealed a web of corruption stretching across 3 provinces. By noon, royal messengers galloped toward distant cities, carrying death warrants sealed with the king's own cylinder seal. Ashur-dan transcribed the final testimony with numb efficiency, his stylus moving automatically across the clay. Master Nabu-Sharu cleaned his instruments with the care of a priest tending temple treasures. You did well, young scribe, he said quietly, once the king and his retinue had departed. Your hand never wavered. Your tablets remained legible despite the distractions. Ashur-dan looked up from his work. Master, how do you bear it? Day after day, year after year. The older man paused in his cleaning, considering. I think of the thousands who live, because one man's suffering revealed a plot. I think of the cities that don't burn, because enemies fear our methods too much to attack. Empire isn't built on kindness, boy. It's built on the certainty of consequences. Through the chamber's single high window, a shaft of afternoon sunlight penetrated the gloom, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny spirits. But surely, Ashur-dan ventured, there must be another way. The old stories speak of kings who ruled through wisdom and justice. Nabu-Sharu's laugh was soft, almost sad. Those kings ruled villages, not empires. When you hold 100 cities beneath your hand, fear becomes the only universal language. News arrived with the morning watch. Babylon was stirring, its king gathering allies for another attempt to break free from Assyrian dominion. The palace erupted into controlled chaos as generals strategized and quartermasters calculated supplies. Ashur-dan found himself summoned to a different chamber, one where maps covered every surface and the tools of war replaced those of torture. General Ashur-dan studied a clay tablet depicting the approaches to Babylon, his scarred fingers tracing potential routes. "Scribe," he barked without looking up. "You've been recording the interrogations. What have we learned about Babylonian sympathizers within our own walls?" Ashur-dan consulted his notes, amazed at how quickly he'd learned to organize information extracted through agony. 3 merchants in the Bronze Quarter, my lord. 2 minor officials in the treasury, all named under persistent questioning. The general nodded slowly. "Fear loosens tongues better than wine. Have them arrested before sunset." As Ashur-dan turned to leave, the general called after him. "Boy, you're learning valuable lessons in those chambers. Every empire in history has fallen because it grew soft, forgot that power must be maintained through strength. The Babylonians think us cruel, but they still pay tribute. The Egyptians call us barbarians, yet they send gifts to avoid our armies. Better to be feared than loved. Love is fickle, but fear endures." The arrested sympathizers filled the chambers for a week. Ashur-dan's tablets multiplied, each one a testament to the empire's methodical unraveling of conspiracy. On the 7th day, something unexpected occurred. One prisoner, a merchant named Marduk-Balassu, laughed when brought before Master Nabusharu. "I know how this ends," the merchant said, his voice steady despite his chains. "I've sold supplies to your armies for 20 years, watched your methods spread fear from the upper sea to the lower sea, but do you know what else spreads? Hatred. Every scream echoing from these chambers creates 10 new enemies in the shadows." Nabusharu selected his instruments without apparent concern. Hatred without power is merely noise. Let them hate so long as they obey. But the merchant persisted, even as the bronze tools approached. "My son fled to Babylon 3 moons ago. He carries with him detailed knowledge of Nineveh's defenses, gained from years of delivering supplies to your garrison commanders. Your cruelty created him, shaped him into your enemy." The master torturer paused, and for the first time, Ashur-dan saw uncertainty flicker across his features. "Every action breeds reaction," Marduk-Balassu continued, his voice growing stronger. "Your empire plants seeds of its own destruction with every application of these tools. I die, knowing my death will inspire others to resist." The chamber fell silent except for the crackling of torches. That night, Ashur-dan couldn't sleep. The merchant's words echoed in his mind like temple bells. He walked the palace walls, seeking clarity in the cool night air. Below, Nineveh sprawled endless under starlight, the greatest city the world had ever known. Guard towers punctuated the darkness, each one a tooth in the empire's jaw. He found Master Nabusharu already there, gazing out at the city. "The merchant's words trouble you," the older man observed. It wasn't a question. "They trouble you too, Master," Ashur-dan replied boldly. Nabusharu sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "When I was your age, I believed absolutely in the righteousness of our methods. Every scream was a brick in the wall protecting Assyrian children. Every confession saved Assyrian lives." He paused, wind tugging at his robes. "But empires are like bodies, boy. They can die from 1,000 small wounds as easily as from one great blow. Each enemy we create is a tiny cut. The question becomes, can we heal faster than we bleed?" Below them, a night patrol marched through empty streets, their bronze spears glinting in moonlight. "The merchant died without breaking," Ashur-dan said quietly. "His silence protects others plotting against us." Nabusharu nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, his family will be brought in. The wife usually breaks when she sees the tools. The children's presence accelerates confession." The young scribe felt something cold settle in his stomach. Children? The merchant's family arrived at dawn. His wife, 2 daughters, and a son barely older than Ashur-dan had been when he began his apprenticeship. Master Nabusharu arranged his instruments with unusual deliberation, each movement heavy with unspoken reluctance. "The boy reminds you of someone," Ashur-dan observed, surprised by his own boldness. The master torturer's hand stilled. "My nephew, same age, same defiant eyes. He died in the siege of Carchemish, fighting for the empire these methods protect." The admission hung between them, like a confession extracted without tools. The merchant's wife held her children close, whispering prayers to Marduk and Ishtar. The youngest daughter, perhaps 7 summers old, stared around the chamber with curious rather than frightened eyes, too young to fully comprehend the purpose of the gleaming instruments. "Begin with questions only," Nabusharu instructed, his voice lacking its usual certainty. Sometimes the threat alone suffices, especially with families. But the woman, like her husband, possessed unexpected steel. "We know nothing of conspiracies," she stated clearly. "My husband sold grain and oil, nothing more. If hatred of your methods makes one a conspirator, then every mother in the empire who has lost a son to your wars stands guilty." The boy suddenly spoke, his voice cracking with youth and fear, but determined. "I am Marduk Balasu's son who fled to Babylon. I returned secretly 3 days ago. Release my mother and sisters. They truly know nothing. I'll tell you everything about Babylon's plans." The boy's confession poured forth like water from a broken dam. Babylon was indeed preparing for war, but not as the generals expected. Instead of direct assault, they planned to inspire simultaneous revolts across the empire's extremities, in Elam, in Syria, in the distant mountains of Urartu. "They call it the strategy of 1,000 cuts," the boy explained, his voice steady now that his family's safety was assured. "While Assyria's armies rush to suppress one rebellion, 3 more will ignite elsewhere. Your forces will stretch until they snap like overstrained bronze." General Shamshi-Adad had been summoned to hear this intelligence. His one good eye studied the boy with predatory intensity. "Names. We need names of conspirators in each region." The boy swallowed hard. "I know only what I overheard in Babylon's taverns and markets. But there's more. They know about your new siege engines, the ones you're building in secret. Someone high in your military command feeds them information." The general's scarred face darkened like storm clouds. "Impossible. Only 5 men know those plans." Ashur-dan recorded every word, but his attention kept drifting to the youngest daughter, who had found his spare stylus and was drawing pictures in the dust on the floor. Simple, innocent scenes of houses and trees, a world away from the chamber's terrible purpose. Master Nabusharu noticed too. "Take the children to the courtyard," he ordered suddenly. Their presence is no longer required. The revelation of a traitor among the high command sent ripples of paranoia through the palace. Within hours, the 5 generals who knew about the siege engines were isolated in separate quarters, each under guard, each proclaiming innocence. Ashur-dan found himself in the unprecedented position of carrying sealed tablets between King Ashur-nasirpal and Master Nabusharu, messages too sensitive for ordinary palace servants. "The empire devours its own," Shamashilu said, when they met briefly in the palace gardens. "Yesterday, these generals dined at the king's table. Today, they await the chambers." His friend's cavalry unit had been placed on alert, ready to arrest whichever commander proved guilty. "How do you determine truth when all claim innocence with equal fervor?" Ashur-dan asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Your master's tools, I imagine," Shamashilu replied grimly. "Though I wonder if torture can make the innocent confess to crimes they didn't commit. How can we trust any confession?" It was a question that had begun haunting Ashur-dan's thoughts. That evening, he watched Master Nabusharu prepare for the most delicate work of his career, extracting truth from men who had commanded armies, who had themselves ordered countless interrogations. "These men know our methods," the master torturer said quietly. "They've steeled themselves against them for years. This will require innovation." The words sent a chill down Ashur-dan's spine. The first general broke after 3 hours, not from physical pain, but from a more insidious torture. Master Nabusharu had ordered his children brought to stand outside the chamber, where they could hear but not see. The sound of their father's favorite daughter crying his name had achieved what bronze implements could not. "General Adad-nirari is the traitor," the broken commander gasped. "He resents being passed over for supreme command. The Babylonians promised him governorship of the entire southern province once the revolution succeeds." But when Adad-nirari was brought in, he laughed bitterly. "Tukulti-Mer confesses to crimes I committed. How convenient. He's hated me since I exposed his skimming of soldiers' rations 2 summers ago. Check his accounts. You'll find Babylonian gold hidden there, not in mine." Each general, when questioned, implicated another. Old rivalries and resentments surfaced like bodies in a disturbed river. By midnight, all 5 had confessed to various treasons, each confession contradicting the others. Master Nabusharu stood amid his unused instruments, frustration evident in every line of his body. "They've all confessed, yet we're no closer to truth," he admitted to Ashur-dan. "Their mutual hatred has created a maze of accusations." The young scribe reviewed his tablets, searching for patterns. "Master," he ventured, "what if they're all lying? What if the real traitor isn't among them? Someone who knew these 5 would destroy each other if suspected." The insight proved correct. While the generals accused each other, the real traitor, a palace scribe who had access to all military correspondence, attempted to flee the city. Guards caught him at the river, carrying tablets meant for Babylonian agents. The revelation struck Ashur-dan like a physical blow. Scribe Nabushumu had been his mentor before his assignment to the chambers, a man he'd admired for his learning and wisdom. Now, brought before the king in chains, Nabushumu stood unrepentant. "I've watched this empire's cruelty for 30 years, he declared, his voice carrying across the throne room. "I've recorded the massacres, the deportations, the rivers of blood. When Babylon offered gold for information, I took it gladly. Better their gold than Assyrian blood on my stylus." King Ashur-dan-Pal's face remained stone. "You betrayed your oath, endangered every citizen of Nineveh. Master Nabusharu, this traitor is yours. Extract every detail of his conspiracy, every name, every plan. Make his suffering legendary. Let word spread that betraying Assyria brings pain beyond imagination." As guards dragged Nabushumu toward the chambers, he caught Ashur-dan's eye. "You'll become like me eventually, boy. No one can record such horrors indefinitely without breaking. The only question is whether you'll break toward cruelty or toward conscience." The words burrowed into Ashur-dan's mind like parasites, eating at certainties he'd thought solid as stone. Nabushumu's interrogation lasted 7 days and 7 nights. Master Nabusharu employed every technique in his considerable repertoire, yet the old scribe revealed little beyond what they already knew. He seemed to exist in a place beyond pain, reciting ancient poems while the instruments did their work. On the 4th day, he began telling stories, myths of gods who punished hubris, tales of empires that fell through their own cruelty. "You know what disturbs me most?" Master Nabusharu confided to Ashur-dan during a break. "He's not afraid. I've broken warriors who conquered cities, yet this scholar defeats me with words and silence." Ashur-dan watched his former mentor's systematic destruction with growing horror and reluctant admiration. Each day, Nabushumu grew weaker in body, but somehow stronger in spirit. as if suffering had transformed him into something beyond merely human. The old stories say pain can purify. The prisoner gasped between sessions. Perhaps that's your true purpose, Master Torturer. Not to extract truth, but to create martyrs. Every empire needs its saints of suffering to inspire future resistance. On the seventh dawn, Nabushumu finally died, taking most of his secrets with him. His last words, whispered to Ashur-dan alone. Remember, beauty boy. Whatever else you must record, remember that beauty once existed in this world. The execution of the 5 falsely accused generals followed swiftly, despite their proven innocence. They confessed to treason, King Ashur-dan declared. Whether true or false, their words cannot be unspoken. The empire cannot appear uncertain. Their families were stripped of position and wealth, cast into the streets as beggars. Ashur-dan watched from the palace walls as General Tukultimer's daughter, once betrothed to a prince, now sold bread in the common market. The sight ate at him like acid on bronze. Master Nabusharu had grown quieter since Nabushumu's death, spending long hours cleaning instruments that already gleamed spotless. "We're supposed to be instruments of justice," he said one evening, unprompted. "But what justice is there in punishing the innocent alongside the guilty?" The question hung unanswered in the torchlit chamber. News from the frontiers grew worse daily. The predicted rebellions had begun. Not the massive uprisings Babylon had promised their conspirators, but something worse, a slow erosion of loyalty. Villages that had paid tribute for generations suddenly found their tax collectors dead. Garrison commanders reported increasing desertions. The Assyrian grip, maintained through fear for so long, was beginning to slip, and everyone in the palace could feel it. "Fear is like a blade," Shamashilu observed during their increasingly rare meetings. "Use it too much, and it dulls." Eventually, people realized that death might be preferable to living in constant terror. A new prisoner arrived under heavy guard, Prince Shamash-shum-ukin of Babylon, captured during a failed raid on an Assyrian outpost. Brother to Babylon's king, his value as hostage and information source was incalculable. Yet when brought before Master Nabusharu, he smiled. "I surrender all information freely," the prince announced, stunning everyone present. "No need for your instruments. I'll tell you every detail of Babylon's plans, positions, conspirators, everything." The voluntary confession felt like a trap. Master Nabusharu circled the prince warily. "Why?" The prince's smile widened. "Because it no longer matters. The seeds are planted, the harvest of hatred already growing. You've created a generation across the empire who dreams nightly of Assyria's fall. No amount of torture can extract those dreams from millions of hearts." He proceeded to reveal everything: names, dates, places, plans. Ashur-dan filled tablet after tablet with intelligence that should have saved the empire. Yet each revelation felt hollow, like victory in a game whose rules had suddenly changed. "You see," the prince continued conversationally, as if discussing weather, "we studied your methods for decades. We learned that sustained fear eventually transforms into rage. Every family you've destroyed, every city you've razed, every scream from these chambers, they're all investments in Assyria's eventual destruction. We merely had to wait for the interest to compound." King Ashur-dan read the intelligence reports in silence, his face revealing nothing. The prince's predictions proved accurate with horrifying precision. Within a moon's turn, 3 major cities declared independence simultaneously. The Assyrian armies, spread thin to address multiple threats, couldn't respond effectively to all of them. More disturbing were the reports from within Nineveh itself. Citizens found dead with no wounds save a small clay tablet pressed into their hands, each bearing a single word: "Remember." Master Nabusharu was tasked with finding these shadow killers, but the chambers proved useless against an enemy that struck and vanished like morning mist. "We're fighting ghosts," he told Ashur-dan after another fruitless interrogation of suspected sympathizers. "They've learned to organize without central leadership, cells that don't know each other. Cut one down, 10 more remain hidden." The young scribe had begun having nightmares, not of the chamber's horrors, which had become mundanely familiar, but of empty tablets, of having nothing left to record, because the empire had finally collapsed. In his dreams, he stood in Nineveh's ruins, stylus in hand, with no words left to write. Shamash-Ilu's cavalry unit was dispatched to retake the rebel city of Arafah. Before leaving, he visited Ashur-dan one last time. "If I don't return," he said quietly, "remember that we once believed we were building something eternal." They embraced, both knowing the empire's eternality was proving as fragile as unfired clay in rain. The Battle of Arafah ended in unexpected Assyrian defeat. The rebels had learned to counter traditional tactics, using the terrain and guerrilla methods that neutralized the empire's superior numbers. Of the 5,000 who marched out, fewer than 1,000 returned. Shamash-Ilu was not among them. Ashur-dan received news of his friend's death, while transcribing confessions from captured rebels. The stylus fell from his numb fingers, clay tablet clattering to the floor. For the first time since beginning his service, he wept openly in the chamber. Master Nabusharu said nothing, merely continued his work, but his movements were gentler that day, as if acknowledging that even torturers could mourn. The captured rebels were different from previous prisoners. They sang while being questioned, hymns to gods of liberation, songs of hope that echoed through palace corridors. One young woman, barely older than Ashur-dan, laughed through her pain. "Every drop of blood you draw waters the tree of our freedom," she gasped. "My children will sing of this moment not with horror, but with pride." Her defiance proved contagious. Other prisoners took up her songs, creating a chorus of resistance that no amount of suffering could silence. The chambers, designed to break spirits, had become a forge for creating martyrs. King Ashur-dan ordered public executions, hoping visible consequences would restore fear's power. Instead, crowds gathered to throw flowers at the condemned's feet. Master Nabusharu fell ill as winter approached, a wasting sickness that physicians couldn't cure. Some whispered of poison, others of divine judgment. He summoned Ashur-dan to his bedside in the palace infirmary. "I've spent 40 years perfecting the art of extracting truth through pain," he wheezed, his massive frame now skeletal. "Yet I wonder if I ever learned any truth worth knowing." He gestured weakly toward a window overlooking the city. "I wanted to protect this. Instead, I may have hastened its doom." Ashur-dan sat beside his master's bed, unsure what comfort he could offer. "You followed orders. You served the empire faithfully." The dying man's laugh was bitter. "Faithful service to a flawed cause is still flawed. You're young enough to choose differently, boy. The chambers will need a new master soon. Don't let it be you." But choice was becoming a luxury Ashur-dan couldn't afford. With rebellion spreading and the palace desperately seeking any advantage, his expertise had become invaluable. He knew every technique, every tool's purpose, every method of breaking human will. The knowledge sat in his mind like poison he couldn't expel. 3 days later, Master Nabusharu died. His final words, "I never learned their names, the ones who died under my hands. Thousands of faces, but I never asked their names. Don't make my mistake, boy. If you must destroy someone, at least know who they were." The king appointed General Ashur-dan as new overseer of interrogations, a man who believed the chambers had grown too soft under Nabusharu's aging hand. He brought new methods from the eastern campaigns, techniques that made veteran guards blanch. Ashur-dan was retained as chief scribe, his experience too valuable to waste. Your former master was an artist, Ashur-dan announced on his first day. But art is luxury we can no longer afford. We need industrial efficiency. He instituted multiple chambers operating simultaneously, a factory of suffering designed to process the ever-growing number of suspected rebels. The screams now never stopped, creating a constant undertone that could be heard even in the palace's farthest corners. Yet despite this multiplication of horror, or perhaps because of it, the intelligence extracted grew less reliable. Prisoners confessed to anything to make the pain stop, creating false leads that wasted precious military resources. One merchant admitted to hiding weapons that didn't exist. A farmer invented entire rebel networks from imagination. The truth became lost in a sea of desperate lies. Ashur-dan recorded it all. His tablets now filled with information everyone knew was likely false, but no one dared question. The empire was drowning in its own methods, choking on the very fear it had weaponized. Even the guards began showing signs of breaking. One was found weeping in a corner, repeatedly washing hands that would never feel clean. The Babylonian prince, still held in comfortable captivity, requested audience with Ashur-dan. "You look older, young scribe. The chambers age a man quickly, don't they?" His manner remained frustratingly pleasant, as if discussing philosophy in a garden rather than empire's collapse. "I've been reading your predecessor's writings." Nabu-Shamu left quite a literary legacy hidden in the royal archives. His early work praised Assyrian might, but his later tablets reveal a man slowly understanding he served monsters. Ashur-dan bristled. "We serve order. Without Assyria, the world would collapse into chaos." The prince smiled sadly. "Is what you have now not chaos? Your own citizens fear their neighbors might be informants. Your soldiers desert rather than enforce increasingly harsh orders. Your enemies multiply faster than your armies can suppress them. This isn't order. It's the systematic creation of universal hatred." He produced a small tablet from his robes. Nabu-Shumu's final essay, written days before his arrest. He predicted everything happening now. Would you like to read the words of your future? Against his better judgment, Ashur-dan took the tablet. The text was painful in its accuracy, describing how fear-based empires inevitably create the conditions for their own destruction. But the final lines struck deepest. "I trained young Ashur-dan to be my replacement. May the gods forgive me. In him, I see my younger self, brilliant, dedicated, and blind to the horror we perpetuate. I pray he awakens before he becomes what I became, a chronicler of atrocities, complicit in evil through the mere act of recording it." Spring brought catastrophe. The Medes descended from their mountain strongholds in numbers never before seen, while Babylon's armies marched from the south. Elam rose in the east, and even Egypt sent forces to reclaim territories lost decades ago. The Assyrian military, once invincible, found itself fighting on 7 fronts simultaneously. In Nineveh, panic replaced arrogance. Citizens hoarded food, wealthy families fled with whatever they could carry, and the palace issued increasingly desperate decrees. General Ashur-dan worked the chambers day and night, seeking any intelligence that might save the empire. But the prisoners now were mostly Assyrian citizens, accused by neighbors of disloyalty. Personal vendettas disguised as patriotic duty. Ashur-dan watched a baker tortured for supposedly poisoning bread, though his only crime was raising prices during shortage. The man's confession implicated his business rival, who under questioning implicated others, creating an endless chain of false accusations that consumed the city from within. "We're torturing ourselves to death," a guard muttered, thinking no one heard. But Ashur-dan heard everything, recorded everything, even as the futility of it became unbearable. The tablets he produced were monuments to madness, careful cuneiform recording the empire's self-inflicted wounds. One night, he found himself laughing hysterically at the absurdity. Here they were, meticulously documenting their own destruction, as if proper records would somehow make the collapse meaningful. King Ashur-dan II died in his sleep, though whispers spoke of poison. His son, Shalmaneser, took the throne amid chaos, immediately ordering a purge of anyone suspected of disloyalty. The chambers overflowed. Bodies were thrown into the Tigris faster than they could be properly buried. The river ran red for 7 days, yet the purge only accelerated the collapse. Every official executed left duties undone. Every merchant tortured meant supplies undelivered. Every farmer imprisoned meant fields unharvested. The empire was devouring itself in its desperate attempt to root out enemies that seemed to multiply with each death. Ashur-dan was summoned to the new king's presence. Shalmaneser was younger than him, eyes bright with paranoid fervor. "You've served in the chambers longer than anyone living. Tell me, how do we make them fear us again?" The question hung in the throne room's sudden silence. Ashur-dan considered his words carefully. "Your Majesty, fear has limits. Push past them, and it transforms into something else. Desperation, rage, even mad courage. We passed those limits long ago." The king's face darkened. "Then what do you suggest, scribe?" "Mercy," Ashur-dan heard himself say, surprised by his own words. "Show unexpected mercy. It confuses enemies more than cruelty, creates uncertainty that—" "Silence!" The king's roar echoed off stone walls. "Mercy is weakness. Double the interrogations, triple the executions. Make them fear us or die trying." The siege of Nineveh began in high summer. The coalition armies surrounded the city like a noose slowly tightening. From the walls, Ashur-dan could see their campfires stretching to the horizon. More enemies than there were stars in the sky. Inside the city, order collapsed completely. The chambers were abandoned as guards fled to defend the walls or desert entirely. General Ashur-uballit was found dead, stabbed by unknown hands, his body left in the very chamber where he'd overseen countless deaths. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Prisoners freed themselves, some seeking revenge, others simply fleeing. Ashur-dan encountered one man he'd recorded confessing to treason moons ago. The man could have killed him. Ashur-dan saw recognition and rage flash in his eyes. Instead, the former prisoner spat at his feet and walked away. "You're not worth the effort," he said. "History will judge you worse than I ever could." The palace became a maze of paranoid courtiers, each suspecting others of planning betrayal. King Shalmaneser refused to leave his throne room, surrounded by the last loyal guards, issuing commands to armies that no longer existed or no longer obeyed. In the royal archives, Ashur-dan sat among thousands of tablets documenting the empire's cruelties, realizing he was likely the last person who would ever read them. The complete record of horror, meticulously preserved, would soon burn with the city. As the siege intensified, strange solidarity emerged among Nineveh's trapped population. Former torturers and their victims found themselves defending the same walls. Class distinctions dissolved in shared desperation. Ashur-dan joined a section of wall defended by common citizens, his soft scribe's hands struggling with unfamiliar weapons. Beside him stood a woman whose husband had died in the chambers. She knew who he was, what he'd done, yet handed him water during a lull in fighting. "Why?" he asked. She shrugged. "Hatred is a luxury I can't afford while arrows fly. Tomorrow, if we survive, I might hate you again. Today, you're just another pair of hands holding the wall." The Babylonian prince was released by deserting guards, but chose to remain in the palace. Ashur-dan found him in the abandoned throne room, sitting on the steps below the empty throne. "You could escape," Ashur-dan said. "Your armies would welcome you." The prince shook his head. "I want to see how it ends. Every empire believes itself eternal until the final moment. That moment teaches more than all the histories ever written." Together, they watched from the palace heights as sections of the Great Wall began to crumble under siege engines, the same designs Assyria had used to break other cities. The irony was perfect, terrible, complete. "Your chronicles will burn with the city," the prince observed. "No one will remember the specific cruelties, the individual suffering." Ashur-dan nodded slowly. "Perhaps that's mercy." The outer walls fell on the siege's 40th day. The enemy poured through breaches like water through a broken dam. Street by street, Nineveh died. Ashur-dan witnessed horrors that made the chambers seem almost merciful by comparison. Centuries of accumulated hatred finally given release. Buildings that had stood since time immemorial burned. The great library, repository of human knowledge, became a pillar of smoke, visible for miles. In the palace, King Shalmaneser made his final decree. "Let the chambers be opened. Let our methods be turned upon our enemies." But there was no one left to obey. The king stood alone in his throne room, crown askew, shouting orders to ghosts. When enemy soldiers finally found him, he was still issuing commands to armies that existed only in his maddened mind. They killed him where he stood, unwilling to grant him even the dignity of formal execution. Ashur-dan and the Babylonian prince barricaded themselves in the archive room, surrounded by the empire's documented cruelties. "These tablets," the prince mused, examining one, "they're not just records, they're confessions. Every empire writes its own judgment." Outside, they could hear the systematic destruction of the palace, room by room, approaching inevitably. "Any regrets?" the prince asked. Ashur-dan considered. "I regret not listening sooner, not understanding that we were creating our own doom with every scream we extracted." The door began splintering under enemy axes. The archive door shattered. Median soldiers flooded in, weapons raised, then paused in confusion at the scene. Two unarmed men sitting calmly among thousands of clay tablets. The Babylonian prince stood slowly, identifying himself in their language. The soldiers lowered their weapons, recognizing him. "This one served the torture chambers," the prince said, indicating Ashur-dan. "He recorded every cruelty, every confession extracted through pain." The lead soldier raised his sword. "Then he dies slowly." "Wait," the prince commanded with surprising authority. "This man possesses something valuable, complete knowledge of Assyrian methods, all their techniques of control through fear. Such knowledge might serve us in understanding how not to rule." The soldier hesitated. Ashur-dan laughed bitterly. "You want me to teach you our mistakes? How considerate. Learn from our horror to perfect your own." The prince shook his head. "Number document it all, every technique, every tool, every failure. Create a record of why fear ultimately fails as foundation for empire. Let future generations read how the mighty Assyria tortured itself to death." The Median commander considered, then nodded. "You'll write everything you know about the chambers. Complete honesty, nothing hidden. It will be your penance and possibly your salvation." Ashur-dan looked around at the tablets that would now burn, all those carefully recorded agonies soon to be ash. "And if I refuse, then you'll experience firsthand the methods you once documented. Poetic justice, wouldn't you say?" Nineveh burned for 7 days and 7 nights. From his prison cell in the Median camp, Ashur-dan watched smoke rise from the city that had once ruled the known world. The screams carrying on the wind weren't Assyrian. Those who hadn't fled were already dead. These were the cries of knowledge dying, of history becoming ash, of civilization collapsing into memory. He was given tablets and stylus, required to write from dawn to dusk, documenting every horror he'd witnessed and recorded. The Median scribes who collected his work read with fascination and disgust. How could you participate in such cruelty? One young scribe asked. Ashur-dan looked at the boy, roughly the same age he'd been when entering the chambers. I told myself I was serving order, protecting the innocent, maintaining civilization. Every torturer needs pretty lies to sleep at night. The Babylonian prince visited daily, reading Ashur-dan's new tablets with scholarly interest. You write differently now, he observed. Before you recorded facts. Now you're recording truth. What's the difference? Facts say a man was tortured until he confessed. Truth asks why we believe torture would save us. Facts list the implements used. Truth questions what kind of society creates such tools. As Ashur-dan wrote, he began understanding that his real torture hadn't been in witnessing horror, but in having justified it for so long. Months passed. The coalition armies dispersed, each taking their share of Assyria's former territories. The Babylonian prince, now governor of the region, made an unexpected decision. Ashur-dan would not be executed, but would spend his remaining years creating a complete account of Assyrian torture methods and their ultimate failure. Consider it your contribution to human knowledge, the prince explained. Future empires will rise, will be tempted by fear's seeming efficiency. Your work might warn them. Ashur-dan was given a small house outside Babylon, guards who were more minders than jailers, and unlimited clay tablets. He wrote obsessively, not just recording techniques, but analyzing the psychology of fear, the corruption of power, the slow poison of justified cruelty. Former victims began visiting, not for revenge, but to add their stories to his record. Each testimony forced him to see familiar events from the other side of the bronze implements. A merchant's widow described waiting for news while her husband was in the chambers. A soldier spoke of being ordered to arrest his own brother. Children, now grown, told of nightmares that still woke them. Why don't they kill me? Ashur-dan asked the prince one day. I deserve their hatred. Hatred would be easy, the prince replied. But forcing you to truly understand what you did, to live with complete comprehension of your role in the horror, that's justice more complete than any execution. Years flowed like the Tigris, carrying away the sharp edges of memory while leaving deeper truths exposed. Ashur-dan's chronicle grew to thousands of tablets, becoming the most complete record of state terror ever written. Scholars from distant lands came to study his work, asking questions that forced him to examine assumptions he'd never challenged. You describe the physical techniques extensively, the Egyptian physician noted, but say little about what torture does to the torturer. What happened to your soul in those chambers? The question haunted him. He began a new section, documenting the slow erosion of empathy, the gradual normalization of horror, the lies necessary to continue such work. He wrote about guards who drank themselves unconscious each night, torturers who couldn't touch their own children without seeing the families they'd destroyed, scribes who burned their work rather than preserve such darkness. The Babylonian prince, now elderly himself, read these new tablets with particular interest. This is your most important work, he said. Anyone can describe how to cause pain. You're documenting how causing pain destroys the one who inflicts it. One morning, Ashur-dan found a young scribe from the new Babylonian administration waiting outside his door. I've been assigned to learn from you, the boy said nervously, to understand how power corrupts, how fear fails. Looking at the youth, Ashur-dan saw himself decades ago, eager, innocent, unaware of horror's proximity. Your first lesson, he said quietly, is that I was once exactly like you. Teaching the young scribe, whose name was Marduk-Zakir, became Ashur-dan's final purpose. The boy was brilliant, quick to grasp concepts, but struggled to understand how reasonable people could participate in systematic cruelty. You keep looking for monsters, Ashur-dan told him. But we weren't monsters. We were ordinary men who convinced ourselves that monstrous acts served righteous purposes. They studied the old tablets together, Marduk-Zakir asking questions that cut like bronze blades. This confession led to executing an entire family. Did you verify its truth? We assumed torture produced truth. That assumption was our first great error. This merchant died under questioning without revealing anything. What did that teach you? That some truths are stronger than pain. That should have warned us, but we simply increased the severity instead. Each question forced Ashur-dan to confront another self-deception, another comfortable lie he'd used to sleep through years of complicity. The young scribe documented these conversations, creating a dialogue between past and present, between the man who had recorded torture and the man who now understood its futility. "You're not just teaching me about the chambers," Marduk-Zakir observed one day. "You're teaching me how good people become evil through small compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time." Ashur-dan nodded slowly. "That's the most important lesson. Evil rarely announces itself. It comes disguised as necessity, as patriotic duty, as maintaining order. The anniversary of Nineveh's fall brought unexpected visitors. 3 former guards from the chambers, men Ashur-dan hadn't seen since the siege. They stood at his door like ghosts, aged beyond their years, eyes hollow with memories that wouldn't fade. "We heard you were writing about those days," one said. "We came to tell our side." They spoke through the night. These men who had held victims while implements worked, who had disposed of bodies, who had cleaned blood from stone floors until their hands cracked and bled. "People think we were sadists," the second guard said. "Some were, perhaps. But most of us, we were just following orders, doing our duty, serving the empire." The third guard hadn't spoken until then. When he did, his voice was barely a whisper. "I see their faces every night, every single one. I remember a young mother begging not for her own life, but for her children to be spared witnessing her interrogation. We refused. The children's presence would make her confess faster, we said." He broke down weeping, decades of suppressed guilt pouring out. Ashur-dan recorded their testimonies, understanding that the chambers had created many victims, not just those who suffered there, but those forced to inflict suffering. The empire's cruelty had poisoned everyone it touched, torturer and tortured alike. By dawn, the guards had said everything they'd carried silently for years. They left lighter, somehow, having finally confessed to someone who understood their burden. News arrived that archaeological expeditions had begun excavating Nineveh's ruins. They found the palace chambers largely intact, the bronze implements still lying where they'd been abandoned, tablets scattered and broken, but some still readable. A young archaeologist brought Ashur-dan several tablets he'd recorded decades ago, asking for translation and context. Reading his own younger handwriting was like conversing with a stranger who shared his name. The clinical precision, the absence of emotion, the careful notation of each scream's duration. Had he really written these things? "These tablets mention you by name," the archaeologist said excitedly. "You're living history, the last witness to the empire's final days. Scholars would pay fortunes for your complete account." Ashur-dan smiled bitterly. "They want to study horror from safe distances, to analyze cruelty without experiencing its weight. But these tablets aren't academic exercises. They're records of real people's final moments, their dignity destroyed, their humanity denied." The archaeologist grew defensive. Understanding the past helps prevent repeating its mistakes. "Does it?" Ashur-dan challenged. "Every empire knows the fate of those before, yet each believes it will be different. They all think their cruelty is justified, their methods necessary, their power eternal." He gave the young man copies of his new work, the analysis and reflection missing from the original tablets. "If you must study horror, At least study it completely. Not just the methods, but the cost. Not just the empire's power, but its ultimate powerlessness. The Babylonian prince, now ancient and near death, summoned Ashur-dan for a final conversation. They sat in his garden, surrounded by flowers that grew from soil enriched by empire's ash. "I've read your complete chronicle," the prince wheezed. 50,000 tablets documenting humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. It's a masterwork of horror. Ashur-dan bowed his head. "I've tried to make it more, to extract meaning from meaninglessness, to find lessons in the pain." "And what is your ultimate conclusion?" The question he'd been avoiding for years. Ashur-dan considered carefully. "That fear is a fool's foundation for power. It seems efficient, even necessary, but it's actually entropy disguised as order. Every act of cruelty creates resistance. Every torture session plants seeds of revenge. Every execution inspires 10 rebels. We thought we were maintaining control, but we were actually accelerating our own collapse." The prince smiled. "You've learned what I hoped you would. Now I have a final task for you." He gestured to a sealed tablet. "My last will. You're to be released from all obligations, free to go wherever you wish. But I hope you'll choose to continue teaching, to ensure your chronicle serves as warning rather than instruction manual." Ashur-dan felt tears for the first time in years. "Where would I go? Everyone I knew is dead. Everything I understood is ash." "Then perhaps," the prince said gently, "you'll find new understanding in the ashes." With the prince dead and his obligation ended, Ashur-dan expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt purposeless. Freedom, so long denied, now seemed a burden. He wandered Babylon's streets, a ghost among the living, carrying memories no one wanted to hear. Until one day, a woman approached. She was organizing a school for scribes and had heard of his work. "Not the torture chronicles," she clarified quickly. "Your analytical work, your documentation of how power corrupts, how fear fails. These are lessons every future administrator needs to understand." The school was small, just 12 students, but they listened with intensity that reminded him of his younger self. He taught them to question authority, to recognize the slow slide from necessity to cruelty, to understand that following orders didn't absolve moral responsibility. One student asked, "How do we prevent becoming what you became?" The question that haunted him most. You remember that everyone subjected to power is someone's child, parent, beloved. You ask whether the information you seek is worth the humanity you destroy to obtain it. You refuse to normalize horror, no matter how common it becomes. And when ordered to do evil, you remember that "I was following orders" is the coward's excuse that history never accepts. His students went on to serve in various administrations, carrying his warnings into positions of power. Some listened, some didn't, but the lessons were planted like seeds in soil, waiting for the right conditions to grow. Years accumulated like sediment, and Ashur-dan found himself the last living witness to Assyria's final days. Younger generations viewed that empire as myth, its cruelties exaggerated by time, its fall a cautionary tale that couldn't really have happened as described. They began questioning his accounts, suggesting he'd embellished for effect. "No empire could have been so systematically cruel," a young noble argued during a public lecture. "Surely you dramatize for moral instruction." Ashur-dan produced original tablets, his young handwriting still clear. "I minimized, not dramatized. The full truth was too horrible for complete documentation. I recorded facts, but facts can't capture the smell of fear, the sound of children crying for parents who would never return, the weight of complicity that crushes souls slowly." He began holding public readings from the original tablets. forcing comfortable audiences to confront the banality of documented evil. Some walked out, unable to bear the clinical descriptions. Others wept. A few understood the warning he was trying to preserve. An old woman approached after one reading. "My grandmother died in those chambers," she said. "For decades, I hated all Assyrians. Hearing you read your own records, seeing your shame, it doesn't erase the hate, but it transforms it somehow." They stood in silence, perpetrator and descendant of victim, sharing a moment of understanding that transcended simple forgiveness or condemnation. History lived in the space between them, neither forgotten nor forgiven, but finally witnessed fully. Marduk Zakir, now a master scribe himself, brought disturbing news. The new king of Elam is implementing systematic interrogation programs. He's studying your chronicles, but not for warning, for instruction. He believes he can perfect what Assyria failed to achieve. The irony was bitter as corroded bronze. Ashur-dan's life work, meant as cautionary tale, was being read as technical manual. "We must go there," he decided, though travel at his age was dangerous. "If my words are being twisted, my presence might untwist them." The journey to Elam took weeks, each day harder than the last. But when they arrived at the capital, Ashur-dan requested immediate audience with the king. Standing before the throne, he saw a young man intoxicated with power's possibilities, surrounded by advisors who whispered of efficiency and necessity. "You honor us, chronicler of Assyria," the king said. "Your work provides invaluable insights into maintaining order through carefully applied fear." "Your Majesty misreads my work," Ashur-dan replied. "I documented failure, not success. Every technique I described ultimately weakened the empire it was meant to protect." The king smiled condescendingly. "Assyria failed because they lacked subtlety, consistency, proper documentation. We will refine their crude methods into precise instruments of statecraft." Ashur-dan realized with horror that his chronicle hadn't prevented history's repetition. It had provided blueprints for its reimagining. Denied further audience with the king, Ashur-dan took his message to Elam's streets. He spoke in markets, in taverns, wherever people would listen, describing not just Assyria's methods, but their ultimate futility. "I've heard your king promises security through fear," he told gathered crowds. Assyria made identical promises. "I documented the results. Not security, but paranoia. Not order, but systematic self-destruction." Some listened, many didn't. But among his audiences were young scribes and administrators who would someday influence policy. To them, he gave special attention, sharing not just the grand narrative, but personal stories. The guard who couldn't sleep, the torturer who died believing himself damned, the empire that tortured itself to death. One evening, palace guards arrived. "You're spreading sedition," their captain announced. "The king demands you cease immediately or face consequences." Ashur-dan laughed, surprising everyone, including himself. Consequences. I'm 90 years old, carrying memories that torment me more than any torturer could. What consequences could you threaten that time hasn't already promised? The captain hesitated, perhaps recognizing truth in the old man's words. "Leave Elam. Tonight. This is mercy you won't receive twice." As they departed the city, Marduk Zakir asked, "Do you think any of them listened?" "Seeds were planted," Ashur-dan replied. "Whether they grow or rot depends on soil I can't control." Returning to Babylon exhausted him beyond recovery. Ashur-dan took to his bed, knowing he wouldn't rise again. Marduk Zakir maintained vigil, bringing fresh tablets for any final thoughts. "I failed," Ashur-dan whispered. "I thought documenting horror would prevent its repetition. Instead, I created an instruction manual for future horrors." His former student disagreed. "You documented truth. How others use that truth isn't your failure, it's theirs. And for every ruler who reads your work as instruction, there are 10 citizens who read it as warning. Visitors came as word spread of his condition, former students, descendants of victims, even a few aging Assyrians who had survived the empire's fall. Each brought perspective, memory, fragment of meaning from the seemingly meaningless suffering. A young girl, great-granddaughter of someone who died in the chambers, sang a lament her family had passed down. The words spoke not of revenge, but of remembrance, not of hatred, but of hard-won wisdom about power's corruption. You see, Marduk-Zakir said, your chronicles aren't just records of cruelty. They've become foundation for understanding how good people do evil things, how power poisoned even the powerful, how fear ultimately fails. That understanding lives beyond any misuse. As consciousness faded, Ashur-dan found himself thinking of Master Nabu-Sharu's final words about not knowing victims' names. He'd spent his last decades learning as many as he could, transforming anonymous suffering into human stories. Death approached like distant thunder, slow but inevitable. In his final hours, Ashur-dan experienced visions, or were they memories? The chambers appeared before him, but now he stood where prisoners once stood, feeling the cold bronze against his skin, understanding finally and completely the terror he'd so clinically documented. Master Nabu-Sharu appeared, looking as he did before illness wasted him. Do you understand now, boy? Ashur-dan nodded. We became what we fought against. In trying to preserve order through fear, we created chaos. In attempting to extract truth through pain, we multiplied lies. We were the disease we claimed to cure. Shamashilu materialized, young and vital as before Arafah. You learned too late, old friend. Better late than never learning at all, Ashur-dan replied. Even Nabu-Shumu appeared, his former mentor bearing no wounds despite his terrible end. You completed the work I began, documenting not just the horror, but its meaning. The empire fell, but understanding rises from its ashes. The visions faded as Marduk-Zakir's voice penetrated the dream. Master, what final words for the chronicle? Ashur-dan gathered his remaining strength. Write this. Empires built on fear carry the seeds of their own destruction. Every cruelty creates its opposite reaction. Every torture session teaches 10 people to resist. The chambers that seemed to protect Assyria actually demolished it, one scream at a time. Let future generations read and remember. Power without mercy is weakness disguised as strength. Ashur-dan died as dawn broke over Babylon, light entering his room like forgiveness he'd never sought, but somehow received. Marduk-Zakir closed his master's eyes, then set about organizing the massive chronicle, 50,000 tablets representing one man's journey from complicity to comprehension. The funeral drew unexpected crowds. Not celebration of an enemy's death, but recognition of someone who traveled the hardest path, from perpetrator to witness, from justification to understanding. The Babylonian authorities, recognizing the chronicle's value, established a special archive. But Marduk-Zakir insisted on one condition. The tablets must be displayed alongside testimonies from victims, creating dialogue between perspectives. History isn't single-voiced, he explained to skeptical officials. Ashur-dan understood that finally. His chronicle gains meaning only when read alongside the voices he once silenced. The archive became a place of pilgrimage, not religious, but educational. Future administrators were required to study there, to understand how incrementally good people become instruments of evil, how small compromises lead to great horrors. Some visitors came to condemn, others to understand. A few came to forgive, not absolving the crimes but acknowledging the criminal's transformation. Years later, an old woman left a tablet at the archive. He recorded my father's death. I hated him for decades, but his final work taught my children why hatred must not become cruelty, why revenge only continues the cycle. In documenting his shame completely, he gave us permission to move beyond it. Decades passed. The archive Marduk-Zakir established became a center of learning, though not the kind originally intended. Rather than studying torture techniques or imperial administration, scholars came to understand the psychology of systematic cruelty, the slow corruption of institutional violence, the way fear ultimately undermines the very power it seems to serve. New empires rose, as empires always do, each believing itself different from those before. Some heeded the chronicle's warnings, attempting to rule through law rather than terror. Others ignored it, convinced they could perfect what Assyria had failed to achieve. Each met variations of the same fate. Fear bred resistance, cruelty created martyrs, systematic oppression systematically created its own opposition. 100 years after Ashur-dan's death, another empire fell to internal rebellion. Among the ruins, archaeologists found a partial copy of his chronicle, margins filled with notes from some imperial administrator. He was wrong. Fear properly applied maintains order. The same administrator's final entry, apparently written as rebels, breached the palace. The scribe was right. We created our own executioners. Marduk-Zakir, now ancient himself, smiled sadly when shown this discovery. Every generation thinks itself wiser than the last, immune to history's patterns. Master Ashur-dan's chronicle doesn't prevent repetition. It just documents why repetition occurs, hoping someone, somewhere, will finally learn. He continued teaching until his death, passing the archive's management to his own students. The chronicle's influence spread in unexpected ways. Playwrights adapted sections into dramas, making visceral what scholarly study made abstract. One play, The Scribe's Lament, followed a young recorder's transformation from eager servant to broken witness. Audiences wept not for the victims, whose suffering was too vast to comprehend, but for the slow death of innocence in those who served the chambers. Artists created monuments at Nineveh's ruins, abstract sculptures representing the weight of systematic cruelty. One piece, called The Spiral, showed how violence curved back upon itself, each act of torture creating the next, until the empire strangled on its own methods. Musicians composed lamentations based on testimonies, creating soundscapes of grief that transcended language. But most meaningful were the small changes. Administrators who questioned orders, soldiers who refused certain duties, scribes who documented both official versions and witnessed truths. The chronicle hadn't prevented cruelty, but it had created language for recognizing and resisting it. A merchant traveling from distant lands visited the archive, reading for days in silence. Finally, he spoke to the curator. In my country, they're building chambers like these, claiming necessity, promising security. I came seeking arguments against them. The curator, one of Marduk-Zakir's students, handed him a specific tablet. This one, Ashur-dan's description of the moment he realized they were torturing themselves to death. Show them that empires that rule through fear eventually fear everything, including themselves. 500 years after Nineveh's fall, the world had changed beyond recognition. New philosophies emerged, speaking of human dignity, universal rights, governance through consent rather than fear. Some trace these ideas' roots back to the archive, to lessons learned from Assyria's documented failure. Yet human nature remained constant. In a distant kingdom, a young king read excerpts from Ashur-dan's chronicle, quoted by philosophers arguing against his harsh policies. Ancient history, he dismissed. We live in enlightened times. Our methods are refined, scientific, humane. His advisors nodded agreement, but one, an elderly scholar, spoke up. Majesty, that's exactly what every empire believed. Assyria thought their bronze implements were the height of sophistication. Each generation's cruelty seems justified by contemporary logic. The king had him removed from court, but the words lingered. When rebellions began in outer provinces, when fear stopped working as control mechanism, when the kingdom started devouring itself through suspicion and paranoia, the king remembered the old scholar's warning. By then, it was too late. His kingdom fell, not to external enemies, but to internal collapse. The same fear that once maintained order, having transformed into the chaos that destroyed it. In the ruins of his palace, archaeologists would find a tablet bearing a single line in the king's own hand. The Assyrian scribe understood what I refused to see. Fear is not foundation, but erosion, not strength, but slow suicide. The tablets held no easy answers, only the weight of witness, the record of what happened when that question was answered wrongly, and the hope that someday, somewhere, someone would answer it right. In the end, Ashur-dan's chronicle achieved something he never expected. Not prevention of cruelty, which seemed woven into humanity's fabric, but the creation of witness, of record, of memory that refused to let horror disappear into comfortable mythology. Each empire that rose and fell added to the archive, their own scribes documenting their own chambers, their own justifications, their own eventual understanding that fear-based power carries its own destruction. The archive grew into a vast library of human cruelty and its consequences, testament to the persistent belief that causing sufficient pain could create lasting order, and the equally persistent proof that it never did. Students came from across the known world, studying not to replicate, but to understand, to recognize the signs, to resist the slow slide from necessity to atrocity. Some succeeded, creating societies that, while imperfect, avoided the chamber's extremes. Others failed, their ruins eventually adding new tablets to the ever-growing collection. But the conversation continued, between past and present, between perpetrator and victim, between the young scribe who entered Nineveh's chambers believing in empire's necessity, and the old man who died, understanding empire's impossibility. On quiet nights in the archive, readers claimed they could hear whispers, not ghosts, but echoes of all those voices, victims and victimizers alike, joining in testimony that transcended individual suffering to become collective wisdom. The bronze implements had long since corroded to dust, the empires that wielded them forgotten except by scholars. But the words remained, pressed into clay and conscience alike, insisting that every generation choose anew between fear and understanding, between the chamber's dark efficiency and the harder path of justice without torture. Ashur-dan would have found it fitting that his life's work became not answer, but question, asked again and again. When power demands you become monster to fight monsters, how do you refuse? As our chronicle closes, the ancient stones of Nineveh sleep beneath modern earth, their testimony preserved not in bronze or blood, but in the careful cuneiform of one young scribe who witnessed empire's dark heart and lived to warn against its methods. The chambers that once echoed with agony now exist only in memory and museum, their implements corroded beyond recognition, their purpose, once deemed essential for civilization, now understood as civilization's antithesis. Ashur-dan's transformation from willing participant to wounded witness reminds us that ordinary people, not monsters, staff history's darkest chapters, each believing their small compromises serve greater good until the accumulation of compromises becomes evil beyond comprehension. The Assyrian Empire, which seemed eternal to those who lived within its shadow, lasted mere centuries. a heartbeat in history's vast expanse. Its fall came not from external conquest, but internal collapse. The very mechanisms meant to ensure survival becoming the instruments of destruction. Fear, deployed as foundation for power, proved instead to be acid that corroded every structure it was meant to support. The tortured became torturers, the oppressed became rebels, the empire became its own enemy, consuming itself in an endless spiral of suspicion and violence. Today, Nineveh's ruins remind us that power without mercy is merely delayed powerlessness, that cruelty creates its own opposition, that fear-based control carries within itself the seeds of its own ending. The bronze implements have returned to Earth, but the lessons they taught remain, whispered across millennia. Empires that rule through terror eventually terrify themselves into oblivion. In the patient clay tablets of one scribe's testimony, we find not just history but prophecy, the eternal return of power's corruption and its inevitable collapse when built upon foundations of human suffering.